Today. I'm Scott Rigell, and I have the privilege of representing Virginia's 2nd Congressional District, and along with my colleague Peter Welch from Vermont, we introduced this morning House Resolution 4208, which authorizes the use of force against ISIS. Our bill is a companion piece of legislation to Senate Bill 1587 that was introduced by Virginia Senator Tim Kaine and Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona. And you're going to be hearing from each of us this afternoon. Our remarks are going to be brief so that we can take your questions. Virginia's 2nd District is home to more men and women in uniform than any other congressional district in the country, and it's with their families in mind and them in mind individually and as a service that I want to read to you the remarks that were made last week by our nation's top uniformed officer, General Joe Dunford, Chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said this before the House Armed Services Committee. This is General Dunford speaking. I absolutely believe that a clear, unequivocal statement of support for the men and women in uniform that are prosecuting the campaign and our allies from their elected officials, that statement would be absolutely helpful. And that is exactly what our House resolution does. And however one might define it, we are in a war right now. And the President has asked us to debate and then pass an AUMF. And on that matter, he's right. So the time is now for Congress to pass an AUMF, and I'm really honored and grateful for my colleagues who are with me today and joining us together in advancing that objective. So I'd like to turn it over now to my friend and colleague from Vermont, Representative Welch. Peter?
Thank you very much, Scott. It's good to be here with my colleagues. As we all know, under the United States Constitution, the responsibility of Congress is to authorize the use of military force. Since August 8th of 2014, when U.S. military action against ISIL began, Congress has been absent. In that time, our military has delivered 8,573 airstrikes in Syria and Iraq at a cost to the American taxpayer of $5.2 billion. One American service member has been killed in a rescue operation. It's time that Congress did its job by debating and deciding America's role in defeating ISIL. Failure to do so would be an utter abdication of our constitutional responsibility and an indefensible transfer of power to the executive. Many members of Congress like to criticize the President for doing too much or doing too little. In fact, Congress is doing nothing at all. It's time for us to do our job. I turn it over now to my colleague, Senator Jeff Flake, who used to be a member of the House.
Well, thank you, Peter.
We haven't forgotten.
Thanks, Peter and Scott. It's great to be here with Tim. Tim and I serve on the Foreign Relations Committee, and it's troubled us for quite a while that Congress hasn't taken the responsibility to do what we know that we should do, as Scott and Peter mentioned. We're into this campaign against ISIS since August of 2014, and yet we still haven't spoken, putting aside whether or not the President has the legal authority to wage war. Congress needs to weigh in, and for the reasons that were said by Scott and Peter, our troops need to hear it. They need to know that the U.S. government speaks with one voice. Certainly, our allies need to hear it. They need to know what we're going to do and what they're required to do. And our adversaries certainly need to hear it as well. So it's important to do this. I'm glad that it's gaining momentum, and so glad that this language has been introduced in the House. Obviously, I don't think any of the four of us are wedded to every word in this bill, but we've got to get started. And this is a bipartisan piece of legislation, and I think it offers the best chance to move forward with this debate.
Well, I want to thank all of my colleagues. What you see is bipartisan and bicameral, and that's important, especially when it comes to war. This is the most solemn thing we do in the country, and certainly the most solemn thing that Congress does. And the fact that we have colleagues of both parties, both houses, now standing together is a very good thing. I want to thank Congressman Welch and Congressman Rigell for putting this forward together with Senator Flake and I. My personal view, the war against ISIL is just, it's necessary, it's noble, but it's illegal. There's been no congressional authorization for this war. And I think absent an authorization, we're now in a war that has started its 17th month without legal authority. There's controversy and argument about that. There are some who believe that the 2001 authorization would cover it. But the RAND Corporation did a study early this week for the Pentagon, and they put out a very clear report saying Congress should do an authorization. On the legal question, they said it takes, quote, legal gymnastics to connect this war effort to the 2001 authorization. But they basically said, look, this is a good thing to do for a couple of reasons. You can clear up legal questions and make it clear. You can send a message of resolve. As my colleagues have said, we ought to be sending a message of resolve to ISIL, that Congress believes that they're a threat. We need to send a message of resolve to the other nations that are part of the coalition, our allies. But we also improve our likelihood of success if we're together. I was reminded recently of a wonderful speech that Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger gave in 1984 on the limits of American power. He was Defense Secretary in the Reagan administration. He surveyed lessons from the Vietnam War. And he basically said, okay, here's some rules that we should basically follow if we're going to try to put American troops into a military engagement. And he came up with 6 basic rules, and I'm not going to read them all, but 2 are most particularly relevant to this situation. Third, if we do decide to commit forces to combat overseas, we should have clearly defined our political and military objectives. That's what an authorization does. It's not just checking the box, that, okay, we did what the Constitution said. It's the President submitting a proposal. It's Congress asking tough questions of witnesses. It's Congress amending the proposal. And then it's Congress and the administration in this constitutionally required dialogue setting out clearly defined mission and objectives. We haven't done that about this war. And then the 5th of Weinberger's 6 points was, 5th, before the U.S. commits combat forces abroad, there must be some reasonable assurance. We will have the support of the American people and their elected representatives in Congress. This support cannot be achieved unless we're candid in making clear the threats we face. The support cannot be sustained without continuing in close consultation. When you go into the war without a debate or without a vote, then you're going into war without getting the American public and without getting the Congress of the United States on board as the framers intended it. That's why they wrote Article 1 and Article 2 the way they did. The declaration of war and the debate that precedes it is what educates the American public about the stakes and hopefully gets the American public behind the mission. We haven't done that yet, and it's time that we do. Again, I thank these colleagues because this needs to be a bipartisan and a bicameral approach. I know when Senator Flake and I introduced our version in the Senate, what we did is we talked to the members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and listened to their concerns. Not so that we could solve every one of them, but so that they could understand that we were trying to at least meaningfully address them as a starting point. Just as it would be wrong not to do an authorization, it would be wrong to do an authorization that was heavily partisan, because that would send a message that is not an appropriate message either. I think this effort indicates that we can be bipartisan on something as difficult as this, and hopefully the introduction of this bill in the House and the continued work that Senator Flake and I are taking on the Senate side will begin to pick up some momentum. And with that, we'll be glad to answer your questions.
Please.
Thank you so much. Your colleagues on both sides of the aisle have been reluctant to take up an AUMF for various reasons. What do you think has changed, and how much support is there for this legislation, and what type of vehicle do you think will get it to the floors?
Well, I think that we have a new speaker. That's in part why I have a renewed optimism that we can advance this. Now, it's uncertain how all this is going to unfold, but I believe that Speaker Ryan is serious about this matter. The arguments against it, to me, fall flat. That perhaps we'll debate this and we won't come to resolution, and that this will really be a disaster of some magnitude in the international affairs of the United States and our prosecution of this war. But as I see it, we must not fear ISIS, nor should we fear the debate about how to defeat ISIS. I think the leadership of the House and indeed the Senate needs to trust the members who are representatives of the people and allow us to go through the process of debating this. And as Senator Kaine mentioned, there's real value in the debate, because it does bring out through media like yourself what the issues are. We need to wrestle with these issues. And these families and the service members who we are putting into harm's way, I guess because of the nature of the district that I have, and I know that every member of Congress has men and women who are serving. In fact, all have had members who have fallen and given the ultimate sacrifice for our country. But I think about them, and I think about what they are owed. And when our top uniformed officer says this would be a help to me, that is full stop. That is reason enough to press forward and push this thing forward. And this is a bipartisan, bicameral initiative, and I hope it. I think we'll be successful if we work hard enough at it. Our colleagues listen to us.
You know, your question is the handicapping of what its prospects are. And I don't have a prediction on that because this is tough. There'll be lots of different points of view about what the language would be. But there's something that's elementally the responsibility of any of us who serve in Congress. That's to adhere to the Constitution. The Constitution requires that the power of declaring war be vested in the Congress of the United States. And as long as Congress abdicates that responsibility, it's a huge transfer of authority to the executive branch. And there's a reason that the Constitution had that provision. James Madison and others were reacting against the power of the monarchs, whoever was in charge, to unilaterally make decisions about going to war. So this is not about handicapping. This is about whether each of us who's taken an oath of office is willing to do our job.
But do you see this as people are just chicken to get into this because the country is war weary after the Iraq experience? As you point out, it might be tough to get a consensus. And furthermore, you know, the new speaker, and I've asked him this a couple of times since he's assumed the gavel. He says no, we have authorization from 02 and 01. He doesn't seem too hep to this.
I do think that our colleagues, that many just don't want to get on the record here. Let's face it, we often will do that if we can. And I just think in this case, with our most fundamental responsibility here in Congress, that's just no excuse. And we need to go on record. It might be a tough vote for some, but that's why we're here. So I do think that that plays into it. And I mean, all we can do is put it forward, push it, and try to convince our leadership to bring it to the floor.
It will be a tough vote, and people are afraid of tough votes. But let's measure how tough the vote is. One service member's lost his life in combat already. 10 service members who have been deployed overseas in Operation Inherent Resolve have been killed in one reason or another, not directly in combat, but in deploying off a carrier and their plane crashed. 5 service members have been wounded in battle in Operation Inherent Resolve. 4 American hostages have been beheaded. So, yeah, the vote's going to be tough, but we have 3,600 people who were deployed thousands of miles from home at Christmas, and they're risking their lives, and some have lost their lives. How do you think their families feel? They know what tough is. You think they're going to be sympathetic with the notion that, oh man, it would be hard for Congress to have a vote of this? I mean, it's just the scale of what's tough is just so monumentally out of balance. So yes, it's part of the Constitution, and we owe it to the troops. And I got to admit, it's even a little embarrassing when you see the Parliament of the UK and the National Assembly of France and the Bundestag in Germany, when you see the Duma in Russia getting called to have a vote before there is military action in Syria and Iraq, what are we waiting for?
But explain, and I guess, Mr. Rigell, you thought that the speaker was more optimistic. I know I've spoken with you, Senator Kaine, and you thought a few weeks ago that things were getting... Now,
let me be clear on this point. It's obvious, of course, that we have a new speaker. I'm not saying that Speaker Ryan has indicated new and sharp interest in this. What I'm saying is that the general tone of the Congress, I fought for this in the previous Congress, and I've been consistent on this matter. This isn't something we picked up, I don't think, for any one of us. This has been something that we've felt very strongly about from the beginning for a host of reasons. Legal, for just the moral backbone part of it, getting the American people aligned on this. But I take Speaker Ryan at his word that the will of the House will be done. And so I really do believe that there is a building momentum on this matter. though the connection between the horrific shooting in California and ISIS is unclear, there is no doubt that there was some nexus there. I think this is brought back to the national attention that ISIS itself is a threat and that it needs to be, to the extent humanly possible, eliminated. And there's far more that I believe we can do. Now, regardless of how one feels about the president's prosecution of this, his call for an AUMF is right and proper, and he's owed that, and more to the point, the troops are owed that.
Are you worried this will be a permanent precedent and that in the future the president will essentially be allowed to engage in military activities without any type of authorization from Congress at all?
I certainly have that apprehension. I mean, if the president is the one who unilaterally can have us be in war, then Congress loses its voice. It doesn't have the support of the American people. The risk, the stakes have never been discussed. And, you know, it's one thing for the president to respond to an imminent threat and, as commander-in-chief, take appropriate action to protect the safety and lives of the American people. But this is 14 years, or 14 months that we've been in, or 17 months that we've been engaged in this. It's going to be something that we have to address for the foreseeable future. So it is a very dangerous precedent if Congress completely abdicates its responsibility by not even having a debate.
Does your legislation envision any cyber component? And then also, I guess more broadly, it's like a separate topic, how do you envision the U.S. government combating ISIS, especially when it comes to propaganda?
So in drafting this authorization, we tried to grapple with the roles of the Article 1 and Article 2. The President's the Commander-in-Chief, not 535 members of Congress. So the authorization is just a straightforward, you're authorized to use, President, is authorized to use the armed forces of the United States as the President determines necessary and appropriate against ISIL or associated persons or forces as defined in Section 6. We give the President the power, which the President has under Article 2, to be the Commander-in-Chief and make a determination about what forces to use, and cyber would be an example of tools the President could use. We do express a view, it's not a restriction on the President, but because leaders in the region, King Abdullah of Jordan most publicly, and because our military leaders, General Petraeus and General Allen most publicly, have said that significant use of U.S. ground troops to combat ISIL would be a mistake, we added a purpose clause in that basically says that the purpose of this authorization is to protect the lives of United States citizens and to provide military support to regional partners in their battle to defeat ISIL. The use of significant U.S. ground troops in combat against ISIL, except to protect the lives of United States citizens from imminent threat, is not consistent with this purpose. So that is our will of Congress to the President, but it isn't a string on his tie as Commander-in-Chief, and he would make the decision in terms of what are the appropriate tools to use.
Yours isn't the only AUMF that's out there right now. There's one from Lindsey Graham that was a lot more expansive. Schiff just introduced one today. I was wondering if you could comment on what you think of those, and also the fact that those are out there. Are you coordinating it all, or is this just kind of like a bit of a free-for-all with everybody responding to the president? And just as a second thing, I mean, you mentioned that you need to try to work on inhibitors. Are there any inhibitors right now, and how does that happen?
We're certainly happy that there are other members introducing AUMFs. There are different. Lindsey Graham's certainly will be less restrictive on what the president does. Maybe somebody else will have one that has more prohibitions or whatnot. But this is the only bipartisan AUMF that's been introduced. The value in this, obviously, to get through the Senate, it's going to need to be bipartisan. And so I think we welcome any that are out there, and whatever starts a debate and gets people realizing we've got to do this, it's a plus.
Yeah, you know, also there's a little bit too much focus on the leaders. The leaders need the members to demonstrate a desire and a will to act. And if we can mobilize the support amongst our colleagues, then it's going to give the latitude that the leaders need to put this on the floor or to make it a priority for the relevant committees.
One of the,
Well, I was just going to say that when I was working through this in our office, we actually prepared a matrix of the ones that were out there and what their attributes were. And it was the paragraph that Senator Kaine read that I thought best matched my assessment of how we ought to prosecute this. And so it was not difficult for me to get on board. And I knew that we needed something that was bipartisan and bicameral. And I, too, support others who are introducing these. And at the same time, I think that the cumulative weight of all of them, plus our consistent bringing this forth and making the case for it, and as Peter said, we actually have to, in some ways, pave the way for leadership to see that there's momentum behind this. And I do believe that we're at a pivot point here in building momentum. In your question?
Just one of the roadblocks has been, what is the AUMF going to say? Senator Graham's AUMF is very different than yours in that he is completely opposed to any sort of limits on time or geography or troops. How do you reconcile that? Do you need to do that before you can get something to the floor?
Yeah. Well, no, I think Congressman Welch said it right. It's the hearing process. So in the Senate, these all get referred to the Foreign Relations Committee, and I'm sure it's the same on the House side. And we'll have versions that we'll debate. I think the two key differences between the Graham proposal and ours is first, we have this purpose clause. So we authorized military force without restriction because the commander-in-chief should determine it. But we put in a purpose clause, and we put it in because that's what, when General Petraeus says it, and when General Allen says it, and when King Abdullah says it, and when others say it, not publicly, but other leaders in the region, we think it's important to point out that a massive ground troop presence that would make it US v. ISIL is actually counterproductive. Right. The other difference between the Graham proposal and ours is this lack of a sunset. I think it is our judgment that one of the lessons from the 9/11 authorization, open-ended, no duration, no geographic limitation, is that periodic review makes sense. In fact, one of the other Weinberger doctrine points is, the relationships between our objectives and the forces we have committed, their size, composition, and disposition, must be continually reassessed and adjusted if necessary. The sunset clause is a forcing mechanism to make sure that that continuous assessment that's necessary takes place in an appropriately timed way between Congress and the executive.
Don't you potentially then run into having this happen every few years then? I mean, because at this point you're saying you don't have the legal authority, so you have to go ahead and have that sunset, or we just set it as that.
I don't think that's a bad thing in war.
We think that's a good thing.
We're
In
all for that.
contrast to the 2001, 2002 authorizations that have been, kind of morphed into the quasi-authority that's being referenced and pivoted upon now. We don't think that's right. Well, in fact, we don't think it's legal. So what we've written is what we believe is best for our country, best for national security, best for our troops.
Maybe one last question.
Thank
All
you.
right, hey, thanks.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.